Hello, this is Kenneth and Heather with the Advancing Equity Coalition, here to give you a quick recap on the November 10th school board meeting. How you doing tonight, Heather?
Good. How are you?
I'm doing well. Yeah, it's snow on the ground, but a bright sunny day. So I don't know what else we can ask for.
A long board meeting. That's what we could ask for. It was a long board meeting.
I didn't ask for that, but that's what we got for sure. So, do you want to give us a quick recap on what went down last night during the school board meeting?
Yeah. So one thing is that we heard a lot of public comment and sentiment around delaying the CDD. We'll be talking about that a little bit more in our longer video. We did hear the results of the student survey and the teacher surveys around distance learning. We heard that our district is going to go back to phase 2 because our COVID numbers are high in our county. The bell times passed, so we'll be having new bell times. We might be talking about that a little more in our longer video. Ethnic studies passed officially. We've been talking about that for a few months. And then yeah, so that's kind of the bulk of the things that we talked about. There's some other things that we're going to get into, but let's talk about the slide of the night.
Yeah, so we have 3 slides of the night, and so here's the first one. So the district shared, after doing a staff survey around what's going on with the overall experiences for staff in distance learning. And what they're hearing is, in the spring, obviously the spring was really hectic, really ridiculous. So ratings were going to be low on how distance learning was going in the spring. But now distance learning in the fall, we're seeing 62% of staff either thinking that distance learning is going good or very good, which is really mind-blowing to me, honestly, based on some of the things that we've been hearing over the last few months from school board members and from union leaders, just around like how terrible distance learning is going and how, the workload. But we're hearing directly from staff that over half and almost 3/4 of the staff thinks distance learning is going well. Now, this isn't to say that there aren't things to improve and that people don't think there are things to improve, but that's definitely something that really, really stood out to me. But then, what you kind of compare this to how students are feeling about distance learning. And that number, again, much better than the spring, almost double the amount of students think that, distance learning is going better than it was in the spring right now. But still, we have under half of our students thinking distance learning is going well, having positive sentiments around distance learning, which also feels really weird to me. Why do we have staff feel so positive about distance learning and students feel so negative? And again, this is still a 20-point gap, but it's not like it's an overwhelming majority one way or the other, but still, this is a pretty significant amount of students that we're talking about, and it just doesn't feel like their experiences are matching up. And it really calls to question for me what students or whose needs are being met really well during distance learning. And then the last one that I'll share really quickly, and I want to get your thoughts on all of these. So, but I just wanted to share is this was really sad to me. We're seeing, around 45% of students feel like they have an adult to check in with. And again, when you compare that to, this overall satisfaction of students, it's right on pace. And then when you disaggregate that by data, it continues to be a mirror of all of the other disparities that we see within Minneapolis public schools. But, students of color are much less likely to feel like they have an adult to check in with. And I shouldn't say much less likely, because it looks like, white students, only about half of them feel like they have an adult to check in with. But, what does that say when, again, we talk about this all the time? We have a student population that is majority students of color. But when we have especially a teaching staff that is predominantly white, and then we see some of these gaps here, what do we know? What do we feel? What are students experiencing? So what are your thoughts on kind of all those slides, Heather?
I mean, I think what I find most interesting is the survey results surprised me so much. The narrative, the people who've been commenting have been saying it's the worst, and you know what I mean? And so I was expecting this to be like a really dire survey. And I think for me, it really proved like you can't always just trust the narrative or the people who are kind of speaking the loudest, that there's always other people who are quietly going along, and I kind of think of that like the squeaky wheel gets the grease. And not that people who are struggling are squeaky, but I do think like I was very surprised that there could be another story out there, that students could be doing well, the teachers could be learning and growing and collaborating. So that really surprised me. And I think it's important always to quantify data against public sentiment or with public sentiment so that we have a more accurate picture.
Yeah, and I want to be clear. I know that it's largely been teachers who've been picketing, and that staff survey includes groups beyond just teachers. ESPs were included in that, and so I do want to just call that out. But again, I do think that's a significant, like you said, there's another side to this story that we're not really hearing. And when we see folks picketing, especially in the middle of an emotional election, those feelings kind of get all wrapped up into one, and you think thus the one story that you're hearing is the only story that exists. And I think there's more to learn and unpack here about the experiences for distance learning. But with that being said, let's move on to our favorite section of our recap videos, our most valuable moment and our do better moment. And I can go first. So my most valuable moment was last night during the school board meeting. Both Director Arneson and Student Representative Janine, who's on his second to last school board meeting. We're really going to miss his voice for sure. But both of them really framed up the issue around, in-school supports and providing a place for students to, actually have support in distance learning versus some of the values that we're seeing that are really held up around sports. And so and other standards or expectations or desires that people have. So Director Arneson really pointed out how ridiculous it is that we cannot provide in-school supports for students, especially students with special needs, and we're really struggling with that. But yet we're willing to allow students to have a wrestling season, perhaps, or whatever sport. And she wasn't saying that necessarily we should be having students back in school, but she is saying, how have we figured it out, or why are we willing to allow students to wrestle, for example, versus but we can't provide them with the academic support that they need. And I thought Student Rep Janine also said something very similar, which is we're willing to pack 100 students into a building in order to take the ACT, but we can't figure out a way to make sure that students get the support that they need. And also we keep talking about sports as so necessary in order to get the social interactions that they need, or that students need. But students who aren't involved in sports also need those social interactions, and they're not really getting them in the ways that they need to or are used to through distance learning. And so I just thought that it was really well framed, something that we've talked about. I think just a really important point to hammer home is like our values don't feel aligned to what should be the priority of Minneapolis Public Schools, the Minnesota Department of Education. So yeah, I just thought that was all.
What's our sports association? We should name them because
the Minnesota State High School League.
Thank you. I always forget that.
Yeah, they tend to be the bane of lots of people's existence. Again, speaking as a two-sport athlete in high school, it is really hard to understand what are we truly prioritizing. I always learned that in student athletes, student came first, and yet we're not prioritizing the student academic needs of everybody in this situation. Yeah, but anyways, right. I digress. Let's hear your most valuable moment.
My most valuable moment was Director Caprini asking Superintendent Graff to get more detail on literacy and dyslexia in the upcoming academic report that we're going to get at the next board meeting. And also the group of parents who organized and wrote letters and We'll talk about this more in the longer video, and really wanted to make public comment but couldn't. But there's a group of parents who are really, really talking about the fact that we do not have a literacy plan. Now, nor I'm coming into your area here talking about academics, but we really need to be talking about dyslexia, literacy, our K2 literacy plan. Is it the right plan? And it feels like we just kind of keep pushing it off and pushing it off. And I know Director Polly has asked about it several times. So I really appreciated Director Caprini saying it and saying, and can we get this added? And then it was named publicly. So now we can watch for that.
Right. And I'll just add, I thought it was also really important that she named her own experience in having dyslexia and understanding that and being diagnosed with that. And I thought, connecting those two really hammered home the point that, this one, there is representation on the board that understands what's happening here. And then two, that this needs to be a priority because we need to figure out how to do literacy for everybody, not just our dyslexic students. Like, everybody is struggling in the literacy. We just need to do a much better job. I'll also add as my runner-up most valuable moment is the fact that they named that they were going to do an academic update in the next committee of the whole. Finally, we have a commitment and a date around when we're going to hear about academics. So, but it's unbelievable that we're going to have one meeting with academics, and we're so excited to finally get some further understanding around academics. But anyway, our do better moments. So I can go. So my do better moment is it's related to Bob Walzer, Director Walzer. It's his second to last meeting, and someone else won in his district, and he's been on the board now for almost 4 years. And over the course of the last couple of weeks, he floated around a resolution to pause the CDD, and he organized folks to flood the lines, to talk about, flood public comment, to talk about pausing the CDD, which is fine, right? If that's what you want to do it. I don't agree with it. The CDD was passed 5 months ago. But this resolution that he floated around didn't even make it to the agenda. And so he had folks call in from all different, parts of the city, really, just all different parts of the city. And they didn't even bring up the issue that they were talking about, because he's just been an ineffective board member. And he's named it. Those aren't even my own words. He's an ineffective board member. And then later in the night, he compounds this with, during the bell time study, he talks about the CDD and wanting to, delay the CDD, as opposed to, and we've talked about this in the past too, instead of talking about the issue at hand. Bell times are a really, really important issue. At some point, you might need to say, okay, the CDD is passed, and need to deal with some of the issues that are right in front of you around the implementation of the CDD. And he refused to do so. I don't know what this strategy is. He has one meeting left now after this, but it just completely derailed the conversation again. Instead of having a substantive conversation about early bell times, late bell times, whatever, the board started to now talk about, again, the merits of the CDD, why it should be passed. Can we move forward? Can we move on? And I think that was, again, really, really problematic, because he, again, was ineffective and did not get the resolution on the agenda that he wanted to get on the agenda. So I thought that was problematic. And then at the end, of the cherry on top, there was, a resolution that didn't really get mentioned, or we didn't mention in our recap, but was a small resolution around, combining all of the budget policies. And he said publicly he hadn't read the resolutions yet, but he wanted other people to do his homework for him and give him the recap. And Director Pauly just responded by saying, look, you can read it. It's publicly available. We're voting on it next month. There are no substantive, it's short. It's very short. There are no substantive changes. We just needed to take 10 policies and make it one, and make it much more readable and understandable. And so, this is a example of what he's done his entire term on the board, of not doing his homework, of derailing conversations, and being completely inept and ineffective. And I think he did a favor to District 4 to not run for re-election, because they deserve better representation than he's provided for the last 4 years. So that is my rant. That is my do better day, moment, whatever. And he has one more meeting left. Let's see what he does with the last few hours of his time on the board. But I've said my piece around that. I will say my runner-up again was no focus on academics, a substantive lack of conversation around academics. We were promised that now for at the end of this month, so I'm looking forward to it. But there's been no, and like board members are asking and begging for it at this point. So we'll see.
We are an academic institution. We are
Right.
an academic institution. Yeah.
So anyways, I'm sorry. I took up a lot of airtime. What
That's
is
great.
your
No,
do better moment?
that's great. It's super helpful. So my do better moment is really kind of just about the narrative that our city keeps telling, that this change is going to be too hard on children, that changing the system, that changing schools is going to be too much. And I do think that change is hard. And I have my own personal concerns about changing buildings and what that's going to look like after this year of distance learning, and where are my kids going to be for 8th grade. I think that's I have anxiety about that. But I think that what we forget about is that there's a group of children, and we can track them by zip code and by race, who have consistently been exposed to change, to ineffective teachers, to not quality education, right? And so when we talk about these things only in the context of change, and we forget that we were already completely engulfed in a system that was this, it just starts to lack a certain genuine or care or compassion for the kids who we cannot keep going as we're going. And so I think my do better moment is really that we as a city need to remember our history beyond this policy. Before this policy passed, which we don't all agree with, it was not good. And I know that a lot of people have said that they had better solutions, but nobody came forward with it. And we were told it was coming by many different groups and individuals. So this is what we have. And I think we have to stop talking about it in this sort of long ago sense that what we had before this was this magical. I mean, people keep saying that these buildings are where our kids need to go. This is their sense of belonging. No, for many, many students in our district, that has never been on the table before. So we need to remember our history and our buildings a little more honestly as we get forward and look into change, which is going to be challenging. But what we were doing was not this amazing magical system.
Right. Yeah. It reminds me of when people say, "Oh, the good old days," and you look back at the good old days. One, who were they good for?
That's right.
I don't know what people are trying to hold on to. I understand, again, like you said, change is hard. Navigating new school buildings, navigating new principals, relationships, that is not easy, especially for parents of color, right? Parents of color may have figured out a way to navigate their way through their building, to make the relationships with the right people, to make sure that their children are safe and protected. I get that, and that is hard to change. Also, though, weighing overall, we are not seeing great results and outcomes for students and students of color. And it's not even just results, right? We're seeing students of color not being treated well. We're seeing, having less access to opportunities. And so this isn't, I'm not sure what we're trying to hold on to and why we're demonizing this change, only because it wasn't your idea. But I totally agree with you. So our short recap hasn't been as short as we promised, but hopefully it was interesting for you and you got a good sense of what happened. We're going to hop on to our next video and talk in depth a little bit more about especially the staff survey and the student survey, and talk about what is going on with, what our understanding of what's going on there. And I hope you tune in. Thanks, Heather.